Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to give you that essential shortcut, through all the really rapid, high-stakes shifts happening in global policy right now. We've gone through a whole stack of sources covering late September, early October 2025, looking at those global flashpoints and domestic fault lines.
Yeah, and these aren't just like isolated news items. What the sources really show us is a story about power, how it's being projected.
Yeah.
You see these major policy decisions, especially out of D.C., and they're immediately reshaping alliances, trade, even domestic power structures. And the speed of it all is, well, it's pretty striking.
Right. So we've boiled this down into three main themes for you. First, we'll tackle what we're calling geopolitical Jenga. There's this unexpected stability plan for Gaza, butting up against rising tensions with Russia and Europe. Second, economic fault lines. Think trade wars, tariffs, and a pretty intense domestic fight over drug prices and innovation. And finally, we'll drill down into the power dynamics shifting inside the U.S. government itself. Big stuff happening there. Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start in the Middle East. There's this, well, frankly, unexpected 20-point plan announced by President Trump to end the war in Gaza.
Yeah, really surprising. And it's not just some vague outline, is it? It's a detailed ceasefire proposal. Crucially, both Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have committed to it.
And maybe even more surprising, it's got buy-in from a lot of Arab and Muslim countries. Getting that kind of endorsement, I mean, that's a major diplomatic lift.
It really is. It changes the whole context. The sources point to some key parts. An immediate ceasefire. Hamas has to release all remaining hostages. Unlimited aid gets into Gaza.
Unlimited aid, okay.
Yeah, and then a phased Israeli troop withdrawal. Hamas has to disarm. That's mandatory. And an international force takes over security.
And what about Netanyahu? His public agreement that Israel won't occupy or annex Gaza, that feels like a huge shift from where he was before.
Oh, absolutely. It's a major pivot. And our analysis suggests it wasn't entirely voluntary. There seems to have been a real loss of patience from Washington, especially after those controversial Israeli strikes on Qatar back in September. That seemed to really push things.
Oh, okay.
But what might make this plan actually stick, long term? It's the support at home. There was an opinion poll right after the announcement, 72% support among Israelis. That's huge for something this big. Wow, 72%. Okay. Let's shift gears then from the Middle East over to Europe. Tensions rising with Russia. We're seeing more of these, what analysts are calling gray zone microaggressions. Exactly, gray zone. It's basically high-stakes harassment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Designed to test NATO, make them nervous, but without, clearly triggering an Article 5 response.
Right, plausible deniability.
Precisely. And the recent incidents are worrying because of what they're targeting. We've had drone flights over Denmark, Norway, Germany, hitting things like power plants, oil refineries, hospitals, even an arms factory. Critical stuff.
And then there was that MiG incident over Estonia. Much more blatant.
Yeah, 3 Russian MiG-31s.
Yeah.
They flew into Estonian airspace, stayed there for 12 minutes. Deliberate violation. Russia's game here seems pretty clear, I think.
Which is?
Well, number one, break NATO unity. Make Europeans doubt if America's really got their back under Article 5 if it's not a full-on invasion. And number two, raise the cost for countries really backing Ukraine hard like Poland and, well, Estonia, obviously.
So NATO scrambled jets. The military response was unified, textbook. But then you have President Trump suggesting the incursions could have been a mistake. How do we square that circle? Military resolve versus sort of murky politics.
That's the core of it, isn't it? That political ambiguity, it just feeds the uncertainty Russia wants, makes allies nervous. But interestingly, the White House did signal some official annoyance.
How so?
By floating the idea, pretty publicly, of giving Ukraine long-range Tomahawk missiles, which would be a massive escalation.
Tomahawks, wow. What kind of range are we talking about? What does that take?
It changes the whole risk calculation. These things have a range of about 2,500 kilometers. That's like 1,550 miles. Suddenly, targets deep inside Russia are reachable by Ukraine.
Okay, that's huge.
And Russia's reaction was immediate. They warned that supplying those missiles risks direct confrontation with the U.S. So it's a very public, very high-stakes red line being drawn right as these gray zone probes are ramping up.
Okay, let's pivot now from geopolitics to economic fault lines, starting with global trade. The USMCA agreement with Canada and Mexico seems to be, well, eroding fast.
It really does. The U.S. has slapped these big tariffs on 25% on Mexican goods, 35% on Canadian goods for anything not explicitly covered by USMCA.
Exact. That's the bit that really stings politically. They're just ignoring the agreed annual duty-free quota for cars and parts, and it's about 2.6 million vehicles each for Canada and Mexico.
And that quota was supposed to apply even if tariffs were brought in on national security grounds. So just ignoring it, I mean, doesn't that gut the whole point of the agreement? It absolutely undermines trust. It sends a message that treaties are, flexible things the executive can just set aside. Mexico's caught in a bind. 80% of their exports head north.
So what did they do?
Well, they tried to manage the fallout. They immediately put new tariffs, like 20 to 50% on about 1,400 products, but only from countries they don't have a free trade deal with. It's partly trying to show the U.S. they're serious about regional rules, even while the U.S. breaks them, and partly to address U.S. worries about Chinese goods coming through Mexico.
Okay, tricky balancing act. Now let's turn to a domestic economic fight, but one where the executive is also flexing its muscles. Pharmaceutical prices, this most favored nation plan, the MFN plan.
Right. The basic idea is, pretty simple on the surface. Why should Americans pay way more for the exact same pill you can get cheaper in, say, London or Paris?
Makes sense to a lot of people.
Sure. The plan ties U.S. drug prices to those lower international prices. But the industry is pushing back hard, and their main argument, which our sources detail, is about innovation.
How so?
They argue drug development is incredibly risky, something like a 90% failure rate in trials. The U.S. market, with its higher prices, basically provides the financial cushion needed to take those expensive risks. Cut that premium, they say, and you kill the incentive for future breakthroughs.
So cheaper drugs now might mean fewer new drugs later.
That's the fear. And there could be other weird effects, too, like maybe companies delay launching drugs in poorer countries just to keep the U.S. reference price high, or maybe they just raise list prices everywhere and use complex rebates so things aren't actually cheaper for most Americans anyway, just less transparent.
Okay, so we've got aggressive moves on trade, assertive moves on drug prices. Before we hit the DC power plays, just a quick economic snapshot at electric vehicles. There was apparently a bonkers rush to buy EVs.
Yeah, total frenzy right before the federal tax credit program ended on September 30th. Everyone rushing to get the discount.
And the expectation now is
a big slowdown in EV sales for the next few months. That surge was purely deadline-driven. Which, speaking of powerful institutions and ticking clocks, that brings us nicely to Washington, D.C.
Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Supreme Court. It's starting a new term, and the expectation, widely, is that it's going to significantly expand presidential authority.
Yeah, this is potentially huge. We could be looking at the overturning of decades of precedent. Specifically, people are watching Humphrey's executor of the United States. That's the 1930s case that stopped FDR from just firing heads of independent agencies whenever he wanted. It preserved their autonomy.
So the court might say the president can fire those agency heads now, like the head of the FTC or other independent bodies.
That's the prediction from most court watchers, yeah.
Yep.
Based on cases like Trump v. Slaughter, which is directly about this, if that happens, it gives the president enormous control over the federal bureaucracy.
Any exceptions?
Well, interestingly, the case about removing Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve, that's been pushed to January for oral arguments. It suggests maybe, just maybe, the court sees the Fed as somehow different, possibly because of its financial independence.
Okay. And then there's the shadow docket thing. Can you quickly explain that for listeners? What is it, and why does it matter that it's being used more?
Sure. The shadow docket is basically the court making quick decisions, often on emergency requests from the government, without the usual full arguments, public hearings, or detailed written opinions.
So major decisions made quickly and quietly.
Exactly. And it matters because it lets the court make really big changes, especially about executive power, without the normal transparency. And related to this, the economist prediction tool, Scott Huspot, is forecasting the administration will win big on its upcoming tariff cases. So you see the court's power directly tying into those trade wars we just talked about.
Right. The whole checks and balances system relies on these branches pushing back on each other. If the court just greenlights more executive power.
Wow. And adding to the turbulence, we've got the first federal government shutdown since 2019 over Senate fights about health insurance tax credits.
Yeah. And the immediate hit is economic uncertainty. Like the Bureau of Labor Statistics can't release its jobs numbers on time. Policymakers need that data, especially now when the economy feels a bit murky. Losing that visibility isn't great.
But the sources point to a potentially much bigger, longer-term risk from this shutdown, right? Something about the federal workforce.
Oh, absolutely. This sounds quite strategic and frankly alarming. The OMB director apparently sent a memo telling department heads to use the shutdown, not just as a pause, but as a chance to fire potentially thousands of federal workers.
Fire them. On what grounds?
On the grounds that their jobs don't align with the president's priorities. It's framed as getting rid of unneeded positions, but it looks a lot like using a funding fight to conduct a political purge of the civil service, getting institutional knowledge. Yeah, that's more than just budget cuts. Okay, finally, this very unusual meeting at Quantico. Hundreds of top military leaders called together by the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth.
Highly unusual.
Yeah.
And Hegseth's message was intensely political. He basically lectured these senior officers about needing to restore the warrior ethos, ending the woke era in the military.
And he told them.
He explicitly said any officer who disagrees with this new direction should resign. That's a direct demand for political alignment in an institution that's meant to be apolitical.
And then President Trump spoke at the same meeting.
He did. And he took it even further, talking about using the military for domestic duties. Mentioned sending the National Guard into Chicago, using dangerous cities as training grounds almost.
Training grounds for what?
He framed it as fighting the war from within, targeting migrants and leftists. It's a really dramatic potential shift, suggesting the military should be involved in domestic political conflicts.
Wow. Okay, so pulling this all together, what does this all mean? We've gone from a surprisingly solid Gaza peace plan, seemingly backed by Netanyahu, all the way to major shakeups in the U.S. military, the Supreme Court, the civil service. It's incredibly volatile stuff.
It really is. And if you connect the dots, you see an administration pushing hard on boundaries everywhere, both at home and abroad. But the signals are often contradictory, aren't they? Like strong support for the Gaza deal, but then ambiguity on NATO defense.
Yeah.
Aggressive tariffs that break agreements.
Right.
So this mix of domestic turmoil, the court, the shutdown being weaponized, the military stuff, alongside these assertive, sometimes erratic foreign policy moves, it creates huge friction and uncertainty globally.
So let's leave you, the listener, with this question to chew on. Given everything we've just unpacked, this mix of internal political upheaval in the U.S., the potential shifts at SCOTUS, the government shutdowns used strategically, the military being politicized, coupled with this very assertive, sometimes unpredictable foreign policy, how should America's partners, countries that really rely on U.S. stability, how should they recalculate? How predictable, how reliable is the U.S. as a global leader right now? Something to think about as you go forward now that you're newly informed.